Okay. Let me start by mentioning that there is a mistake in the notes. So you should add a multiplicative factor 2 in the right-hand side of formula 12. I'm sure there are many other mistakes, but this is what I noticed. Okay, so let me make some comments which I did not have time to make yesterday about the continuum random tree. Or CRT. So this is, in my presentation, this is tree coded. In a sense, I explained in detail yesterday. This is a tree coded by a normalized Brownian excursion. So of course, it's a random tree because it's a tree coded by a random function. Okay, and so the CRT was introduced about 20 years ago by David Aldous. Okay, in particular, there are two papers in 91 and in 93 in the Annals of Probability. So if you look at these papers, the presentation of Aldous is not the same as this one. He has a different way of defining the CRT, especially in the first paper. And it's called, I think, the Brownian CRT. And the connection with the Brownian excursion is made in the second paper, in fact, the paper of 93. Okay? And there is a slight difference also in normalization. So in Aldous' paper, the CRT is a tree coded by twice the Brownian excursion. Of course, this is just a matter of normalization. Okay? So another remark I wanted to make is that the CRT appears as a scaling limit of many classes of discrete trees. Okay, so in a sense, it's a universal object. There are many different classes of discrete objects whose scaling limit is given by the CRT. Okay, so we saw that it is, oh, I forgot limit here. Sorry. We saw that it is a scaling limit of plane trees, but we could have considered binary trees, we could have considered Cayley trees, and there is also some recent work, I think in particular by Gregory and his co-authors, showing that it's also the scaling limit of unordered trees. Okay. So plane trees are ordered, and this was very important in what we did in the last 2 days. But if you look at unordered trees, then you will also get the CRT for scaling limit. Okay, I don't want to discuss that very much here, just a passing comment. This is not really a course about the CRT, nor a course about trees. What I'm interested in is graphs or planar graphs or planar maps, as we will see tomorrow. So the CRT for us is just a technical tool. Okay? Okay, so in this connection, what I want to do today is to discuss labeled trees. So maybe erase that. So this means that I will add an additional structure to my discrete trees. I will assign to every vertex of the discrete tree a certain label, okay, according to rules which I'm going to define in a while. Okay? The motivation for studying these labeled trees, well, will not be apparent today. You will see the motivation tomorrow, because these are really the right objects to code the planar graphs that we are going to consider. Okay? So today I will simply ask you to believe me that these are interesting objects, and we will see tomorrow why they are interesting, okay? So a labeled tree is a pair, while consisting on one hand of a plain tree tau, and on the other hand of a collection of labels. Okay, so I will denote the labels by LV. So these are labels assigned to the vertices of the tree. So in my definition of a plain tree, tau is a plain tree. Tau is just the set of all its vertices, okay? So V belongs to tau means the vertex, of course, of the tree, okay? So what properties do I require? I will require that for any vertex V, the label is an integer, can be positive or negative. I will always require that the label of the ancestor, the root of the tree, is 0. And the last very important condition, I require that if I have two neighboring vertices, so if V and V prime are linked by an edge of the tree, or if you prefer, if V is the parent of V prime, then the difference in absolute value, LV minus LV prime, is less than or equal to 1. Okay, so when I cross an edge of the tree, the label can change by at most 1 in absolute value. Okay, so just to give you an example, let's take a very simple plain tree. Let's take this one. So remember, I had represented the different vertices by sequences of positive integers. Okay, I can always do that. And then I put labels in addition, so I change the color. So the label of the root is always 0. And then, for instance, here when I cross an edge, where the label here can become -1, the label here can become +1, for instance. Starting from +1, for instance, I can have here label 0 here. I can have label 1 here, label 2 here, and say label 2 here, for instance. Okay, so this is a possible labeling of my tree. Okay, so I have represented here an example of a labeled tree. Okay, so you see, in fact, that well, for each edge of the tree, you have 3 possible choices for the increment of the label along this edge. Okay. So I introduce some notation. TK will be the set of all labeled trees with k edges. Then it's almost trivial that the cardinality of Tk is equal to 3 to the power k times the cardinality of Ak. I remind you that Ak was a set of plain trees with k edges. Okay? Okay, so now essentially I want to play the same game with labeled trees than what I did with plain trees. I want to understand scaling limit of labeled trees. So I'm going to pick one uniformly at random in this set, and let k tend to infinity. And okay, look what I can say about a large labeled tree. Okay, so for this I'm going to use coding functions. Okay, so we saw that a plain tree can be coded by its dig path, or what I call the contour function. We will also introduce a coding function for the labels. Okay? So this is what I'm going to call the spatial coding function, contour function. So how do I define it? Well, whenever I have a tree toe, I can, let's say that it has k edges. I can define what I call the contour sequence of toe. So this will be a sequence of vertices, V0, V1, V1, V2, up to V2k. And how do I obtain these vertices? Well, I do the same thing as I did during the first lecture. I just imagine that I explore the tree following the contour from the left to the right. This. And I just record the vertices I meet during this exploration. Okay, so the first what I mean, of course, is the root. So I will always have V0 equals the root. So in this example, the next one is vertex 1. And then I go back here to the root. So V2 will also be the root. V3 will be the vertex 2, and so on. V4 is 2, 1. V5 is 2, 1, 1. V6 is 2, 1. OK. I do not continue. I think it was clear. OK, so of course, this sequence is related to what I call the contour function of the tree. The contour function just gives me the generation of the vertex Vi. Okay? And now if I want also to keep track of the labels, I introduce the spatial contour function. So I define V of I. This will be simply the label of the vertex Vi. Okay? So in this example, for instance, I can represent well this spatial contour function as I did for the contour function. I will also use linear interpolation to define this function for every real t. Okay, so V defined, let's say for t belonging to 0 to k by linear interpolation. Okay. Okay, so back to this example. So you always start from 0 at the root. Then what do? Here I have label -1. So at time 1, I'm going to be at -1 here, see? Okay. Then I go back here, I have 0, and so on. Then I go here, I have 1. I go to 2. I stay at 2 once. I stay at 2 once more. I go back to 1. I come to 0. I go back to 1, 1, 1. 1, 2, 3, and then 0, and I think that's all. Okay? Should be 2k. Okay. So this is the spatial contour function, and it's more or less obvious that if I know these two discrete functions, these characterize the label tree I started from. Okay. Just like if I had only the contour function, I characterize the plane tree too. Okay, so essentially what we will try to do, well, we will try to have a scaling limit for this pair of contour functions of a large labeled tree chosen uniformly at random, in a way similar to what we did when we had only when we didn't have the labels, when we had only the tree. Okay, so in order to describe the random processes that will arise in the limit, okay, I need to introduce new objects. So, I mean, okay, so the first part of the talk. And the second part, I'm going to introduce the snake driven by a function g. Okay, so I consider a function g which will satisfy the same assumptions as I had yesterday. It's a function defined on the interval 0, 1, taking non-negative values, continuous, and such that it starts and finishes at 0. Okay? So you should think of this function as coding a tree, as we saw yesterday. And here I will assume some additional regularity on the function g. I will, in fact, assume that g is Hölder continuous. Okay, so meaning that g of s minus g of t is bounded above by some constant t minus s to the power gamma for some gamma positive. Okay? I can have any value of gamma positive. Okay, so now let me remind you of the notation I also introduced yesterday. mg of st is going to be the minimal value of g over the interval st, so s infimum t, s supremum t. Okay, so the minimal value of g between s and t. And I need a simple lemma. This lemma says that the function mg of st is a non-negative definite in the usual sense. So this means that if I take S1, SP in 0, 1, if I look at the matrix mg of Si, Sj, so for ij between 1 and p, so this matrix is non-negative definite. Okay, so if you prefer, so we have for every lambda 1, lambda p in R, the double sum from ij equals 1 to p of lambda I, lambda j, mg of Si, Sj. This is non-negative. Okay, so I'm going to prove this lemma because it's very easy to prove, and of course, this is important for what follows. Okay, so I can erase that. Everybody has seen. So proof of the lemma, well, you fix a real t, a non-negative real t, and you define a relation on, well, for ij between 1 and p. You say that I is equivalent to j if the minimum of g between Si and Sj is greater than t. Okay, so it's very easy to check that this gives you an equivalence relation. On the set, not on this full set here, but on the set of indices I, such that g of Si is greater than t. Well, the only thing that is not obvious is that this relation is transitive, and, but it's, okay, it's almost immediate. Okay. You just have to write it. Okay, so now if you look at the double sum over I and j of lambda I, lambda j times the indicator function, that the minimum between Si and Sj is greater than t. Well, you can group the terms that appear according to the equivalence classes for this relation. So what you get is the sum of all classes of this equivalent relation. And then if you pick indices into the same class, okay, you have all possible values of ij in this class, okay? So it means that what you get is just the sum for I belonging to C of lambda I squared, okay? Okay. Okay, you just expand the square and you will arrive at this, okay? Okay, so obviously the right side is non-negative. Okay, so this quantity is non-negative, and then what you just do, you just integrate from 0 to infinity this quantity. This will also be non-negative. And of course, if you integrate with respect to t, you will get exactly the this sum here. Okay, so this proves the lemma. And okay, now I can use the standard fact about Gaussian variables. If I have a non-negative definite matrix, I can find a Gaussian vector whose covariant matrix is given by this matrix here. Okay? Okay, and more than that, in fact, here I have even the function mg of st. I can construct a Gaussian process whose covariance is given by this function. Okay, so consequence of this discussion. There exists a Gaussian process. So it's a one-dimensional Gaussian process. So it's going to be centered. I call it ZGT. So indexed by the interval 0, 1, such that the covariance of, well, it's centered. So the covariance is just the same as the expected value of ZGS ZGT is equal to mg of st. Okay? And in fact, we can get regularity properties of this Gaussian process because we note that if we want to compute now the L2 norm of the difference ZGS minus ZGT, well, you just expand the square, and what you find is g of s plus g of t minus twice mg of st. Okay, now you should remember that you've seen that yesterday already. This is what I called dg of st, so the distance associated with g. But here, because we have a Hölder continuity assumption on the function g, just by looking at this formula, I can see that this is bounded above by twice the same constancy as there. So s minus t to the power gamma. Okay? Okay, and then, of course, because we have Gaussian variables, we have similar bounds for all the moments, say all the even moments of this difference. And we can apply the Kolmogorov's continuity criterion. We get that this process here has a modification with a continuous sample path. So I will assume that I have immediately taken this modification, that this has continuous sample path. Okay. Okay, so this is what I will call the snake driven by G. Okay, so let me comment on this definition because, well, this may seem a little bit mysterious why we take this covariance function and so on. In fact, there is a much simpler way of seeing this process ZG. This is related to the tree coded by G. Okay, so because of this calculation, we see that, so this is a remark. We see that if dg of st equals 0, well, of course, this expected value is equal to 0, so ZGS is equal to ZGT almost surely. Okay? And I remind you that dg of st equals 0, this is by definition, I said this meant that S was equivalent to T. For the equivalent relation I used for defining the tree coded by G. Okay? And okay, you can write this in a slightly stronger form. You can say that almost surely for every ST such that S is equivalent to T, we have ZGS equals ZGT. Okay, just the same, except that I have the set of probability 0 there does not depend on the choice of S and T. Okay? So this means that, in fact, my process ZG, which was indexed by the interval 0, 1, I can view it as indexed by the quotient of 0, 1 for this interval, this equivalent relation. Okay, you can, ZG can be viewed as indexed by the quotient space of 0, 1 for this equivalent relation. And by definition, okay, this is what I call the tree TG. Okay? So it's very natural to view the snake as indexed by the tree coded by the function G. And in a sense, it's also very natural to say that ZG is Brownian motion indexed by TG. So what do I mean by that? Okay, just take a very simple example of a function G. Okay, let's take that this is G. And okay, we saw yesterday that for such a simple function, the tree coded by G is also very simple. You have a first line segment here corresponding to this height here. Then we have a branching. Let's say a height segment like this. Okay, something like that. Okay, okay, that's simply the tree TG in this case. Now, how do you construct Brownian motion indexed by such a tree? Well, it is very easy. I draw the picture, but you imagine that. So I will represent the real line horizontally. And you imagine that okay, so the origin is here, say. You will first take a Brownian motion corresponding to this time interval here, time interval of the same length as this segment. Okay? And then you have a branching, okay? So you will have another independent Brownian motion starting from this point here, corresponding to this line segment. So I draw it here. Okay? Similarly, a Brownian motion corresponding to this one. Of course, these two Brownian motions should cross, okay? Just for the picture that I put them away from each other. There's no reason why this one should be on the left and this one on the right. Okay? Just for the picture. And then at this level, another branching point, okay, and so on. Okay, so I think it's clear what I'm doing. And now, if you want to recover the process ZG, well, say, suppose you take a vertex here at this level in the tree, A. So you look at the value of the corresponding Brownian motion at this level. Okay? So you will have here the value of. Okay, so it's just really you run independent Brownian motions along the line segments of the tree. At least when the tree is simple like this. Okay. So it's the obvious definition of a Brownian motion indexed by a tree. So when the function g is more complicated, you cannot do the construction like this immediately. But still, it's very natural to have this interpretation. So you may say, well, why did I choose this definition here, and why? I could have said immediately, well, I'm going to consider Brownian motion indexed by the tree. Okay? So this would be fine here, but later, as we saw yesterday, I'm going to take for G a random function. I'm going to put the Brownian excursion here. And then, okay, then your tree is a random set. Okay, so if you do that, you need to consider a stochastic process indexed by your random set. Okay, and you can do that, but it's not so usual in probability theory. So I prefer to avoid that. Okay, this was just a remark. So I will come now to the third part of the lecture, which will be the longest one. So you should remember the definition of the contour sequence. This will be useful. So I will explain now convergence to the Brownian snake. Okay, so first need to explain what the Brownian snake is. So as I just said, I'm going to randomize the function g here. So I will replace g by a Brownian excursion, a normalized Brownian excursion. Okay, so what I say is that we can construct a pair of processes. The first coordinate will be the Brownian excursion, and the second one I will denote it by ZS with the following properties. So as I just said, E is going to be a normalized Brownian excursion. And second property, well, conditionally on E, the process Z will be distributed as a snake driven by G. So you can do that. So this is fine. Remember that in order to define the snake driven by a function, I needed this Hölder continuity assumption. This assumption is okay if I take G equals Brownian excursion. So this is the classical Hölder continuity properties of Brownian motion, and can take for gamma any number of the form 1/2 minus epsilon. Okay? So given E, I can define the Brownian snake driven by E, and okay, I can do both things together just using a product measure. It's very easy. Okay, so this pair EZ will be what I call the Brownian snake, okay? Or simply the process Z, but okay, so this is not quite the same terminology as usual, but okay, it's not very different. Usually, the Brownian snake is defined as a path-valued process. Here, E corresponds to the lifetime process for this path-valued process, and Z to the terminal point process. Okay. But essentially, this is equivalent to the usual definition. Okay, so why is this interesting now? But I can come back now to the initial problem. Or perhaps before coming, okay, I will make one remark just to mention that these objects have other applications than the ones that will be discussed in these lectures. So, a side remark, if you introduce this object, this Brownian snake, you can also introduce a random measure. Okay, I'm going to denote by script capital I. Defined by, well, I say that I applied to any test function phi is the integral from 0 to 1 of dt phi of zt. So the same z as here. So this random measure is called ISC. So I will not tell you what this means, ISC, unless you ask. This was also introduced by David Eldous, by the way. It's one-dimensional ISC here, okay? Because okay, in my definition here, I've taken always a one-dimensional Gaussian process, but you could take as well a d-dimensional Gaussian process. It's exactly the same construction, okay? Okay, so this random measure has appeared in a number of scaling limits for models of statistical mechanics in higher dimensions. And so let me mention that there are connections with statistical physics. In particular, if you look at scaling limits of lattice trees or percolation clusters also. So it's in the work of Gordon and his co-authors, okay? And co-authors, I should say. Okay, I'm not going to give the full list. Okay? So this is not, of course, in these papers, these are results for high dimensions, okay? Models of statistical physics in high dimensions, and you get d-dimensional ISC, not the one-dimensional model. Okay, so it's just a parenthesis to explain that these objects arise in a number of different contexts. Okay, so now I will come back to the initial problem, which was to understand the scaling limit of labeled trees. So maybe I can do that here. I will state the theorem. Okay, so let theta k L k v, v belonging to theta k, be uniformly distributed over the set, which I denoted by capital Tk. So Tk, I remind you that this is a set of labeled trees with k edges. So let Ck and Vk, so these are discrete functions. Well, these are functions indexed by the interval 0 to k, be the contour function and the spatial contour functions associated with this label tree. And then, well, you can get a scaling limit for this pair of processes, okay? And what do you get? Well, for the first component, we already know what we get because it's just the same result we saw on Monday. We have to rescale this function by 1 over square root of 2k. And of course, we rescale time also on the interval 0, 1. And then we know that this converges to the Brownian excursion. And now for the second part, well, the rescaling is different. So what we need to put is 9 over ak to the power 1/4. And otherwise, the rescaling in time is the same. This converges in distribution, again, in a functional sense, okay, as before, in the sense of weak convergence of the laws on the space of continuous functions. And the limit is precisely the Brownian snake, so Et. Okay, so now I'm going to prove this theorem. In fact, this is, okay, yeah, please. Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. Yeah. This is only, if you want, this is only a particular case of a much more general result. Okay. And, okay, this is what I said before. I'm going to spend some time, well, all the remaining time, in fact, proving this theorem. Okay, so that's going to be maybe a little technical. I'm sorry for that. And you may say, well, why is it interesting? Okay, why is this special case interesting? And for instance, and even why would a more general case be interesting? And okay, you have to trust me that this will be the technical tool that Gregory in particular and also me, we will be using in the next lectures. Okay, so it's a technical tool. If you look at the convergence of the contour function, I mean, that's really interesting in its own. Okay, it's really a nice result about trees. Then you may ask, well, why consider such labels and so on? Okay. It's not, okay, I will say it's not a very surprising result because you can think of the way the labels are constructed. They are constructed in some sense by running a random walk along the tree, okay? So the labels, if you want, form a tree indexed random walk. Okay. You just have your tree, and you along each edge you add +1, -1, or 0. Okay, just like a random walk. Okay. So what I'm saying, in a sense, is that a tree indexed random walk, if I rescale it properly, is going to converge to a tree indexed Brownian motion. Okay, so it's not a big deal. You may say, well, it's more or less clear. Okay. Still, I will give a proof that there are technical issues. So, I want to do this carefully because it's going to be very useful later. But I agree with you. It's only, you could have something much more general. As long as the increments of the labels are centered and, say, bounded or have moments, you will get the same limit. Okay. Okay, so there is, of course, a first remark, which is more or less obvious, which is the fact that theta k, if I forget the labels, theta k is going to be uniform over the set of plane trees with n edges, okay? Simply because if I for any given tree with k edges, I have the same number of possible labelings, okay? Okay, so by the theorem we saw already, we know the convergence of the first components. Okay? We know that this converges to this, okay? And maybe I will write it. We know that this converges in distribution towards a Brownian excursion. Okay, but then there is a technical trick. Each time you have a convergence in distribution like this, for processes with values in a Polish space, which is the case here, well, you can replace it by an almost sure convergence. Okay, so this is a representation theorem due to Skorokhod. Okay? Okay. Of course, to do that, you need to replace each of the three theta k by another tree having the same distribution. But no matter, it's here you can take anything with the desired distribution. So you, in order to prove this. Okay, so you can assume, without loss of generality, that you have even almost sure convergence here. Okay, it's only a technical point. It's not very useful, but it simplifies some arguments. Okay, so as usual, when you want to prove this, there are two steps. So the first step is a convergence of finite dimensional marginals. So what does it mean? It means that if I take, say, p times t1 less than t2 less than pp less than 1, I'm going to look at this process only at this finite collection of times. So I'm going to look at ck. Okay, so let's normalize it immediately. Ck of 2k ti, 9 over 8k to the power 1/4 vk of 2k ti. And I want to show that this converges for I between 1 and p, sorry, that this converges when k tends to infinity towards the vector eti, zti. Okay, so first, really trivial remark. You can put here, if you want, the integer value. Okay, so I put brackets to mean I take the integer values. Does not change anything because the difference, these functions are Lipschitz, are one Lipschitz. So I make a small error if I replace the time by the integer value. Okay, so this is what we need to prove. Okay, so I will do it carefully for p equals 1. And maybe a little less carefully for p equals 2. And I will not do the general case, but you can guess how it is done. So let's do the case p equal 1. So maybe I will remind you of the definitions. Okay, p equals 1. So I introduce this notation for the contour sequence of theta k. Okay, so remember, it means you explore the tree by following the contour, and you record all the vertices that you visit. Well, of course, some of them are visited more than once. So some vertices appear more than once in this sequence, but no matter. Okay, so what is Ck of 2kT1? As I said before, it's just the generation of the vertex that you visit at step 2kT1. Okay? So what is Vk of 2kT1? Well, this is now the label of the same vertex. That's the definition we took. Okay? And now, well, how do you get the label? So suppose you have your vertex is here, Vk1. It's somewhere in the tree. Okay, this is the root. So how do you get the label of this vertex? Well, you need to add all the label increments along these edges. Okay? And each time the label increment is going to be -1, 0, or +1 with equal probabilities. Okay? Simply because I took the uniform distribution. So all possibilities have the same probability. Okay, so how many steps do I have? I have this number of steps. And what do I add? I'm going to write eta I, if you want, for the label increments. So the numbers eta I are IID. They are uniform on the possible values, -1, 0, 1. And they are chosen, of course, independent of theta k. Okay? Okay. So basically what you see now is that you are going to apply a central limit theorem to say that at least conditionally on this is going to be large. This is approximately Gaussian. Okay? So to do this, perhaps in a precise way, well, this is the case p equals 1, so I'm being very careful. So you just look at the pair you are interested in. You look at the pair okay, so let's look at Ck first. And I do the rescaling. And I'm going to look at Vk. But I will rescale Vk by 1 over square root of Ck. Okay? Okay? And I say that this is going to converge in distribution as k tends to infinity. So for the first component, we already know that it converges to ET1. Okay? So this is just a convergence which is here. Okay? And for the second one, well, you have this Vk, which is written in this form. And so what you do, what I'm doing here, I'm normalizing by the square root of the number of terms. And of course, what's important is that, of course, the number of terms is random, but it's independent of the variables that I that occur there. So it's quite easy to see that you get here a normal variable, and you also have a constant. Constant corresponds to the variance of eta I, which is 2/3. Okay? Okay, so n is a standard normal variable and is independent of E. Okay, so that's really very easy to check. Okay, I've given an argument, a detailed argument in the notes, just by computing characteristic functions, but it's nothing but the central limit theorems, except that you have a random sum, but it's okay. Okay, so now this is not really what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is the quantity which is here. Okay, so maybe I can avoid rewriting everything. So I look at this quantity, and I do the following trick. I just keep the first component. And for the second component, well, I'm going to write it in the following way. I'm going to write it as 3/2 to the power 1/2 times ck of 2k t1 over square root of tk to the power 1/2 times 1 over square root of ck times vk. Okay? So I've not changed anything, okay? You can check that this is the same constant. I have square root of k to the power 1/2, k to the power 1/4 here. This one cancels with this one and so on. But if you write it in this way, you see that everything there is written in terms of this pair here. Okay? So this pair here I'm interested in is just a function, a simple function of the pair which is there. Okay? So you can apply the convergence in distribution. So the first component converges to this, of course. And for the second, well, this constant here is going to cancel with this one. You have this square root here. Okay, so this is the square root of the first quantity. So it converges to square root of et1. Okay? Okay, so that's what you get. And now, it's very easy to see that this is exactly the same distribution as et1, zt1. Okay? So it's okay. We have obtained the convergence of one-dimensional marginals. Okay? So why is it true? Remember that conditionally on E, well, by definition, conditionally on E, zt1 is Gaussian with mean with variance, sorry, et1. Okay? That's just the definition of the Gaussian process. Okay? So it's exactly the same as saying that zt1 can be written in this form. Okay, no question about that? So it's a little bit technical, but I want to give some details of the proof. I will go faster for the case p equals 2. Okay? So what happens for p equals 2? So I take 2 times now. So what's going to be different? Well, we try to write the same thing as here for T1 and for T2. But of course, now there is some dependence in the edge increments. Okay, when you have two vertices, so it will be Vk, Tk, T1, and Vk, Tk, T2. So they are somewhere like this in the tree, say, for instance. Okay, and the root is there. Of course, you see that the edge increments from the root to VKT1 are the same as the increments from the root to VKT2 up to this level here, okay? Which corresponds to the generation of the last common ancestors. the most recent common ancestor to the two vertices. Okay, so what is now this generation? Now, this generation corresponds exactly to what I denote by K of 2KT1 to KT2. Well, this is the minimum of the contour function between these two times. Okay, maybe I introduce the notation here. So why is it so? Well, so when you explore the tree following the contour, you do this, so on, so on. It's very easy to see that the minimum of the contour between the time when you visit this vertex and the time when you visit this one corresponds to the generation of the last common ancestor to the two vertices. Okay? So once we have done this remark, we can say that if we look at the pair Vk to Kt1, Vk to Kt2, it has the following distribution. Well, there will be a common part. The common part is going to be sum from I equals 1 to Ch(k). So I will simply write this in this proof Ch(k), okay, of eta I plus, then I have the sum and increments on this part here above the level of the last common ancestor. So it's a sum from I equals 1 to Ck to Kt1 minus Ch(k), the prime I. And then, okay, for the second one, I have the common part. So this part is exactly the same. And, of course, then I have an independent part. So all the variables eta I, eta prime I, eta second I are independent and always the same distribution. Okay? That's just by construction of the labels. So now you can play the same game as what I did, you see, in the case P equals 1, looking at these quantities, renormalizing by the number of terms here. So you renormalize each of these sum by the number of terms. And the point is that if you look at the number of terms, so you have Ch(k), and you have these two differences. Well, you know that this converges to infinity. This depends only on the contour function, and you can use, it's even a convergence, an almost sure convergence here with my assumption. You can use this almost sure convergence here to see that this converges in distribution towards, well, the minimum will converge towards the minimum of the Brownian excursion between T1 and T2. This will converge to the Brownian excursion at T1 minus its minimum. And the same for the last term. Okay. So now you know how to handle, in fact, the number of terms in each of these sums. And so you can, just the same argument will give you the scaling limit. So I write it for this pair only. So I should also put the contour, but I just look at this. So I multiply all this by 9 over 8k to the power 1/4. and you get that this converges in distribution. Okay, so essentially, so the number of terms here for this sum essentially the minimum. So you will get square root of the minimum times a Gaussian. So here the number of terms converges to this quantity. So you will get square root of ET1 minus the minimum times an independent Gaussian, because the increments are independent, of course. And the same for the other term. You have the common part, square root of the minimum times the same Gaussian as here, plus square root of ET2 minus ME of T1, T2 times an independent Gaussian. Okay, so just playing the, okay, just doing the same thing I did here to derive this. Okay, so then it's fine because you can recognize, or maybe you don't recognize immediately, but this has the same distribution as ET1, ET2. Okay. So conditionally on E, the two components are Gaussian variables with the right variance, and their covariance, you see the covariance of the two components is the minimum, in fact. This square root multiplied by this one. So it will be the minimum as desired. Okay, okay, so in this way we get the case P equals 2. So I will not do larger values of P because we still have to work. It was only the first step, convergence of finite dimensional marginals. But you can guess that the general case is handled in a very similar way. You can really analyze everything without any problem. It's a little bit tedious to write, but there are no real difficulties. Okay, no questions about that? Okay, now I come to the last part. So, the second step, when you want to prove a convergence of processes in a strong form, as I want here, in the functional sense, you need to have tightness. Okay, so you need to show that the laws are tight in the space of probability measure on the space of continuous functions. Okay, so here one can deal separately with each component, okay, because the product of compact set is compact. Okay, so for the first component, we already know the result. Okay, there's nothing to say for the first component. We already have the desired tightness. So the whole problem is to get tightness for the second components here. So it's enough to prove a bound of the following type. For every integer p greater than 1, there exists a constant kp such that the expected value of vk of I minus vk of j to the power 4p will be bounded above by kp times I minus j to the power p. And of course, the constant kp does not depend on the integer k. Okay, so I should write this. Okay, so why is this enough? Well, it's a standard argument. If we have this will imply that expected value of, I look at the increments of the process I'm interested in, this one. So now I do the proper renormalization here. I forgot the constant, it doesn't matter. And if I raise this to the power 4p, This is going to be bounded by Kp times T minus S to the power P. Okay? And, okay, so actually this gives just a uniform bound on the moments of the increments of the process, which is here. Okay? And then it's a standard argument. It's basically the same argument as in the proof of the Kolmogorov's continuity criterion, which tells you that the sequence of processes is tight, okay, once you have this. Okay. No, it will be sufficient to have it for a p greater than 1. Okay, so p equals 2 is enough here. But I'm going to prove it for any p. Yeah. Okay, so how do we prove this? Well, I keep the same notation I have here. So I remind you that Vk of I is the label of the vertex Vki, okay? Vk of j, the label of the vertex Vkj. And so when we do the difference, we see that this difference has the same law as the sum from L equals 1 to, this is the graph distance between Vki and Vkj in the tree of eta L. Okay, so let me explain this. Okay, the same picture as before. So you have your vertex I here. So I should write it Vki if you want. And you have your vertex Vkj here. So how can you write the difference between the labels of these two vertices? Well, you have to sum the label increments along all these edges. So these are my eta L's. So I should write this in distribution. Okay? And how many such edges do you have? But it's exactly the graph distance. Okay? Between Vki and Vkj. Okay, so once you have this, you can immediately say that if you raise this to the power 4p, this will be bounded by some constant, say, k prime p, times the expected value of the number of terms in the sequence. So this graph distance to the power 2p. Okay, you get such a bound each time you bound moments of a sum of independent random variables which are centered, and here they are bounded, which is more than necessary. Okay? So this is a very classical bound. I forgot the name, but if you've never seen that, you just expand the sum and you look how many non-zero terms you have, and okay, you will find that you have this order of non-zero terms. Okay. Well, the key point, of course, is that the variables eta L are centered, of course. Okay, so now what is the graph distance? Well, in terms of the graph distance, I don't know if I already mentioned that. It can be expressed in terms of the contour function. It's the same as Ck of I plus Ck of j minus twice the minimum of Ck between I and j. Okay, I'm using this notation here. Okay? That's almost clear, okay? Because, okay, I told you that this minimum corresponds to this generation here. So what I'm doing here, I'm doing this plus this. It gives you the graph distance. Okay, so it's enough to prove that this quantity is bounded by what we want. That is the expected value of ck of I plus ck of j minus twice the minimum of the contour between I and j to the power 2p is bounded by some constant I minus j to the power p. Okay? This is what we want to get here. Okay. And now there is another nice combinatorial trick, in fact. It's enough to prove this when I equals 0. So I wanted to prove that for all I smaller than j between 0 and k. Okay? But it's enough to consider I equals 0 even. Okay, and I equals 0, of course, this simplifies a lot. Okay, this tells you that you just have to prove that expected value of ck of j to the power 2p is bounded by constant times j to the power p. So why is it enough to take I equals 0? Well, there is a rerouting argument which is very similar to something I did yesterday. So I think I will use almost the same notation as what I did yesterday. I will write I plus j bar. This will be I plus j mod k. Okay? Modulo 2k, sorry. Okay? So with this notation, what you can check is that if you look at this process, ck of I plus ck, so I put here, instead of j, I put here I plus j bar, minus twice the minimum between I and I plus j bar. You look at this for a fixed value of I, and as a process in j, so for j between 0 and 2k, this has the same distribution as ck of I, ck of j, sorry, for the same values of cos of j. So why is that true? Okay, I think Nicolas will do that in one of the exercise sessions, but just to give you the idea, so ck is this contour function. So suppose that, okay, you have, here I fix I, so you have your vertex vi, which is somewhere here. Okay. And suppose what you do, you change the root is here, but you change the root and you put the root here instead. You reroute the tree at this vertex, and you look at the corresponding contour function you get, okay? Like this. So now starting from this new root here, and the contour function that you get, for the same reason we had yesterday in a different setting, will be this function. Okay. Okay. And now the point is that the rerouted tree has the same distribution as the initial tree. Okay, so its contour function, which is written here, has the same distribution as the contour function of the initial tree. Okay, I don't say more about that, but it's a combinatorial trick. Okay, so now to finish, we just have to prove this. So, well, I have 10 minutes, so that's going to be enough. Maybe I can erase the statement of the theorem. So essentially, I'm going to use arguments which I already used on the first day. Oh, just a minor remark about the proof of this. This quantity here is obviously greater than expected value of the difference ck of I minus ck of j to the power 2p. So if you remember on the first day when I proved the convergence towards the Brownian excursion for the contour functions, I didn't do the tightness, but the tightness follows, in fact, from this bound. Okay, so this can be used to complete a proof which I did not make completely the first day. Okay, so now let us prove this. So you have to remember that I write Sn for simple random walk on Z. Okay, and I write T for the infimum of n such that Sn is -1. And the key fact we use on the first day is the property that this CK is distributed as an excursion of simple random walk. Conditioned to have length 2k, that is conditioned on t equals 2k plus 1. So we saw that on the first day. Okay, so if I look now at the probabilities that ck of I is equal to L, so it's the same as the probabilities that Si, okay, I will take J, sorry. Okay. Better. The probability that Sj is equal to L, knowing that T equals to K plus 1. Okay, so also in proving this, I will assume that J is less than K, okay? Because you can use a symmetry argument. You know, the contour function is invariant under time reversal, okay? So you can assume that J is smaller than K. And so this will be useful, okay? So J is less than K. Now, this conditional probability, so it's the probability of the intersection. So Sj equals L intersected with T equals to K plus 1 divided by the probability that T equals to K plus 1. Okay? And now I'm going to use, roughly speaking, the same arguments that I used on the first day. Perhaps the first thing to say is that I look at the bottom, at the probability that T equals to K plus 1. Just an application of the Kemperman formula, which I wrote on the first day, is telling you that this is the same as the probability that the random walk is at -1 at time 2k plus 1 multiplied by 1 over 2k minus 1. Okay? Again, you can see that by using, by considering cyclic permutations of the increments of the random walk. Okay? And essentially, this quantity here is of order a constant over square root of k. Okay? Just by a standard local limit theorem. Here it's a simple random walk, so you have explicit formulas, in fact, for that. You can check by just use Stirling formula to verify that. Okay. So the whole thing is bigger than some constant k to the power -3/2. Okay, and now I look at the numerator here in my formula. So this quantity is equal to, I think I wrote the formula on the first day. If I apply the Markov property, this is the same as the probability that I am at L at time j, and I have not yet hit -1, times the probability for my random walk starting from L that I hit 1 at time 2k plus 1 minus j. Okay? It's just a Markov property for the random walk. So again, I can, for this term, I can play the same trick as here, use Kemperman's formula. And you, okay, the difference is that you start from L. So when you apply Kempelman formula, you find L plus 1 over 2k plus 1 minus j times PL, that S at that time is minus 1. Okay, so certainly what you say then is that because j is between 0 and k, okay, this 2k plus 1 minus j is between k and 2k. So this is, again, of order k to the power minus 1/2, just like this one. No, not of the order, I would say bounded by a constant times this. Okay, this would be better, okay? Because you look at a random walk at time k, okay, the probability that it takes given values is bounded by a constant over square root of k. Okay, so the whole thing here is bounded by a plus 1 times k to the power minus 3/2 with a certain constant C1. We keep the L plus 1, which is here. And for this quantity, you use a time reversal argument. Okay, this will be the same by time reversal that PL, that T is equal to J plus 1. And in fact, there is a factor 2, which is the one I forgot in the notes. Okay. And again, you can use Kemperman. Okay, it's the same as 2L plus 1 over J plus 1 PL, that S at time J plus 1 equals minus 1. And I don't do anything more for the moment. So I finish here. So it's almost finished. So what you get finally for, well, I will immediately write the bound I get for the probability. That Ck of j is equal to L. Okay, so for the denominator, I had this lower bound. Okay, and for the numerator, I get upper bound. So I first have this thing. So I will have C1 k to the power minus 3/2. I will have L plus 1 squared twice, divided by j plus 1. And then what remains is this probability here. Well, factor 2 if you want. And this probability by translation invariant is the same as P0, that Sj plus 1 equals A plus 1. Okay, you just shift the origin and you use symmetry also. Okay, so all this cancels nicely. You find only a certain constant C times L plus 1 squared over J plus 1 times this probability. And finally, when you look at the expected value now of this to the power p, or 2p, okay, remember this is what I want to bound. Okay, so you write this as a sum for L to the power 2p, the probability that Ck of j is equal to L. And you substitute there the bound which is above. And what you will get an upper bound by C times 1 over j plus 1, which is here. And what you will get, in fact, the expected value of Sj plus 1. But because of the square which is here, you will get Sj plus 1 to the power 2p plus 2. Okay? And And now, it's just simple random walk. So this quantity here, for simple random walk, you look at the moment of order 2p plus 2 at time j plus 1. This is bounded by j plus 1 to the power p plus 1. Okay? And so, of course, this cancels, and you get exactly what I wanted to get here. Okay? So I'm sorry, it was a bit technical. Maybe I should not have done it. But I've done the proofs rather completely. And as I said before, this is going to be an important ingredient for what we will do later. Okay? So this is finished. I don't know if there are any questions I can answer. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Make it smaller? Sure. You're right, yeah, you're right. So you should be able to have some kind of stochastic domination and to say that it should be easier. But still, you have the fact that you force your random walk to stay non-negative. Okay, so this tends to push your random walk up. Okay, so it's not so clear. Okay. Okay. So I found this argument when I was preparing the lectures, and I thought that it was rather simple. But when you try to explain it on the blackboard, it's not that simple. But still, it's reasonably simple, I think. And but there may be something simpler. Okay. There are other methods, of course, for doing that. Okay, just one way. Okay.